Hey guys, welcome back to the video. I just got up watching Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, and in my opinion, it is one of the greatest comic book movies of all time. I'm absolutely overflowing with thoughts on this movie, so I'll be splitting up this video into multiple different chapters. So if you want to check out the timestamps for those chapters, they'll be linked in the description down below. And I do want to give a fair warning that this video will be containing massive spoilers for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. And I won't necessarily be talking about the overall MCU, just because this movie tends to focus on the Guardians of the Galaxy themselves. And with that being said, I want to start off with the first chapter in this video talking about how this movie embraces the end. This movie is long and epic. It is 2 hours and 30 minutes, which has somehow become the norm for movies nowadays, which I personally don't mind because I will love sitting in the theater for as long as I possibly can, being immersed in a different world. But I'm going to be honest, this movie at times felt longer than something like Avatar: The Way of Water. And that might be a hot take, but I think the main reason for me is just because there were so many sets, there were so many big things, but they were riddled with absolutely depressing flashbacks. And this is where I'm going to start getting into spoilers. So again, if you haven't already seen the movie, like this video, come back to it later. But if you've seen the movie, you know that throughout the entire film, we get flashbacks to Rocket in the High Evolutionary's experimental room, his ship, and just Rocket's entire upbringing, all of the friends that he made, what used to be his family, and then the fate of those characters, which I'll get into later in this video. We see all of this riddled throughout the entire film, and that's why I find this movie to feel so long, is because through all of the jokes, through all of the happiness, through all of the comedic moments with the rest of the Guardians throughout the movie, while most of the time Rocket is still dead, I still found that every time we got to a flashback scene, every time we stepped away from the Guardians themselves and went into Rocket's mind and his psyche, I was just absolutely depressed. I was torn to shreds. I wasn't crying the whole time. I did cry 3 separate times, which we'll talk about at the end of this video, because I have a lot of thoughts on the moments that I cried at. But those interjected flashbacks made this story feel so much longer. It made it feel like it was 3 hours long. And honestly, I'm dreading rewatching this movie, and I'm going to be seeing it for a second time. I'll have seen it a second time by the time this video goes up, but I'm dreading rewatching this movie strictly because of the fact that every time a flashback scene comes on, I know it's going to be sad. Even though I've already seen the movie, that doesn't make it any less sad, and it's just going to be a pain to actually watch again. And the same thing kind of goes for Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. Though the movie isn't like extremely dragged on or way too long in my opinion, I still do find the fact that it's very tonally sad and depressing to be a reason why I can't go back and revisit it. Now I'll talk about the other Guardians movies later in this video, but this movie definitely just goes full on with the sets, and I think James Gunn took that initiative of, yes, we're gonna go and do flashbacks, but we're also gonna have the Guardians go on this hunt, this exploration of how to save Rocket, and that allows for the movie to be paced out a lot better. We start off on Nowhere, which is where the Guardians left off from the Christmas special, and then they go to the Org Corp planet. I think it's called Org Corp, I don't know for sure, but it's basically the High Evolutionary's place where he can like store a bunch of his experiments, all that kind of stuff. And then they go to Counter Earth, and then they have the ship-to-ship battle, and through all of this you have the flashbacks interjected, of course. I think the fact that there are so many sets and so many unique elements throughout all of the different sets, the movie feels like it's way longer. And honestly, if some people brought up that argument of they're just going from planet to planet, nothing's really interesting, they're just moving along, it's like a stupid basic mystery, that's all that it is, I could see that argument, I guess. But if you're already attached to the Guardians characters, you understand how much this mission means, and you understand why they go through all of this and why it feels worth it to go from planet to planet and taking your time and having these flashbacks and not having that linear story itself progress and taking time away from the linear story to actually go through, learn about Rocket's backstory, and then progress in the linear story. And you just keep repeating that until Rocket comes back alive in the beginning of the third act of the movie. Before I get too deep into Rocket's character, I do want to talk about the action in this movie, because it's action like we've never seen it before, and that is strictly from the way that this movie is shot. it feels like it is shot in such a wide manner. Maybe it's just because I'm absolutely obsessed with wide angles right now for some reason. I love me a nice wide angle fight scene, some dynamic action. Punching through a wide angle lens just looks way more dynamic than punching through a regular lens that's static. And James Gunn did exactly that. It felt like he was catering to specifically me by using all these crazy wide angle lenses. That first fight alone on Nowhere with Adam Warlock is so cool. And I'm going to talk about Adam Warlock in just a second here because he is one of the greatest catalysts in any Marvel movie I've ever seen. The way that this film is shot is so dynamic. It feels so fluid. I do have a slight problem with the way that the action is cut at times, but the way that they utilize the wide lens, especially with like Drax versus Adam Warlock in that first sequence on Nowhere, is absolutely perfect. And just overall, it is very brutal. I'm going to talk about the High Evolutionary, the brutality of this movie, and how honestly it could be rated R. I'll talk about all of that in a separate section of this video because the High Evolutionary is one of the greatest MCU villains ever. But again, I don't want to get too deep into that. The action itself feels so much more fluid than any of the other Guardians movies, and I really like that specifically because the way Adam Warlock is introduced is just as this guy that is hunting down the Guardians. And story aside, we obviously do know that he ends up like siding with the Guardians, he becomes a good guy, fights against the High Evolutionary. I love the way the story itself plays out, and for the limited amount of screen time, he's great. But the way that his dynamic with the action is put towards the Guardians is really, really good. I also really just love the way that they just do the action for Adam Warlock. This makes me even more excited for a James Gunn Superman project. The way that they kind of showed him speeding while he was flying, but also keeping it clear enough for us to see what he's doing. I feel like, and this is kind of getting off topic here, I think James Gunn honestly did the exact opposite of what I wanted Flash and Superman to do. I wanted Flash to go a lot faster so we could see his speed in real time, which is what Marvel did right with Makari in my opinion. And with James Gunn, he does like that Superman style with Adam Warlock, that flying action. It's a lot slower. You can see the background speeding up, but Adam Warlock seems to be staying in the frame at the same pace, whereas Zack Snyder's Superman just is like a blur and he goes into the sky. And when he like gets into the sky and slows down, there's that one shot in Man of Steel, obviously, where he's pointing up and the camera's like turning around him. That's obviously slow. But in the midst of actually flying, he just goes and hits Zod and then they stay in place, hits Zod and stays in place. With Adam Warlock, it feels a lot more dynamic because you can see him in all the action. This also is the case for the hand-to-hand action. Obviously, his punches aren't as fast as Superman, and when Drax is like blocking a punch, the camera stops, and then they do like a flip on the camera. It just feels like the camera was always on a gimbal, but in a good way. You can have way overly dynamic shots, and that does seem to be a problem a lot of times with action because directors are like, oh, we want to just make it look cool. But James Gunn adds that sense of style, but on top of that, he keeps it true to the characters. He gives Adam Warlock a unique perspective of flying that we've never seen, which, in my opinion, again, Zack Snyder's Superman couldn't do, right? But he also combats it with just a basic feat like super strength with Drax. He employs it so well, and then when they fight one-on-one, you can see that clash of style with just weird, wacky camera work, but also just portraying these superpowers really well. Adam Warlock, in general, is just the perfect catalyst, and this movie has so many of them, from Adam Warlock to Gamora to even just like Endgame as a whole. This movie was set up really well in my opinion, and I know a lot of people are like, oh, James Gunn probably didn't get to fulfill his truest desire with the outcome of the Guardians because of Infinity War and Endgame and the Russos and Feige and all these other creative things, right? I think to an extent, it actually aided a lot of the storylines in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, at least from looking at a final product perspective. Firstly, Adam Warlock. Now, I don't know if they were going to use Adam Warlock in Infinity War Endgame because in the comics, he does have a lot of impact with the Infinity Gauntlet in the Infinity Saga. But that aside, I think Adam Warlock's inclusion here worked perfectly. Now, obviously, it's because James Gunn wrote him to have a good inclusion. Like, James Gunn used him for a reason. I'm just complimenting that it was a good reason. Now, on the other hand, something like Gamora and just the effects of Endgame as a whole Star-Lord mentions Endgame a lot in this movie, actually. He talks about Thanos, he talks about just rulers in general, and he also talks about his own actions in Endgame. And I really like that they're self-aware about all of these actions in the past of the universe, while not still letting them really dictate how they move forward. Now, obviously we know Gamora is now a Ravager because it's the past version of herself. It's the version that's like 5 years ago or whatever it was. And this version, at the end of the movie, ends up going back to the Ravagers, doesn't fall in love with Star-Lord. Star-Lord goes back to Earth with his grandpa, all that kind of stuff. We really get to see a full circle character moment for Star-Lord because it is a different Gamora. Now, James Gunn in interviews has talked about how they were going to kill Gamora off earlier in Volume 2 because Zoe Saldana didn't really want to play the character for the long time in the future.
Gamora almost died in Volume 2. I knew from the beginning Zoe only wanted to play the character for so many years. She's been very honest saying that this is, she's done. I was going to have her die. I thought she was the one who was going to sacrifice herself and Quill was going to learn about himself as opposed to Yondu in the second movie.
And so they're just going to kill her off earlier. But this story doesn't necessarily need her to be killed off. And honestly, and I'm going to talk about this more later in the video, I kind of messed with the fact that they didn't kill anyone off. Like, obviously they went really far with Rocket, pretty much as far as to have his heart rate go to 0 and then come back alive. But the idea that they can just use these pre-existing things and just integrate it into this story, and though, yes, it makes it feel a little bit longer because we have longer sequences because they're taking time to actually try to catch Gamora up, or Quill is trying to get this dynamic back with his old Gamora. Like, you see all of these different things take up the runtime of this movie, but it all works. But that leads me to talk about the greatest pitfall of this movie, and that is the external story. Like I said from the very beginning of this video, this is one of the greatest comic book movies of all time. James Gunn puts on a masterclass of all elements for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. But the reason why it can't be one of the greatest movies of all time, in my opinion, is strictly because it relies too much on external storylines and honestly external character work. I think the reason why Rocket's character works so well and has progressed so well throughout the course of this movie is because of his relationships with not only Yondu, but the rest of the Guardians in the first 2 movies. Star-Lord, the only reason his arc feels nearly as complete as it is because we've been with him for 11 years. These characters on their own, yes, they make a compelling story. We've seen that in Guardians 1. And Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 would still be absolutely amazing if not for those external elements. But in my opinion, the external elements add just too much to the story. They're just way too important. And in that case, and I've seen a lot of people say this on the internet, this movie feels like an epilogue rather than a chapter 3 of a 3-part story in the Guardians of the Galaxy franchise. When talking about greatest of all time, you also have to put the Guardians trilogy as one of the greatest trilogies ever made. Now, I don't want to get too deep into my thoughts on the trilogy as a whole, just because I will be doing a ranking of all of the MCU trilogies so far, as Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 pretty much concludes the last trilogy we're going to have for a while now. So stay on the lookout for that video coming out later this weekend, but I still just really like the overall story that they're telling. And again, a lot of people might just be like, oh, this movie can't stand on its own. It focuses too much on previous character developments. It's not that much of a gripe for me. It definitely has a ceiling for the movie, but the ceiling is already very high because the movie itself is crafted so freaking well. But now I think it's finally time to talk about the villain himself, the High Evolutionary, because he is pure evil. I don't think there's any other way to describe the High Evolutionary because there is no, right thing. Even Thanos, wiping out half the universe, yes, that's absolutely absurd, but the High Evolutionary creates a universe or a world, demolishes it if it's not perfect, creates another one, demolishes it, creates another one, demolishes it. I was gonna try to analyze the High Evolutionary in my notes, but I just couldn't because he's pure evil. I think the strength of the first and the third Guardians movie is that the villain is very simple. They're either serving a higher purpose, with Ronan it was Thanos, or in this case, they just want to be pure evil. Where Guardians 2 definitely has its fault is in ego being so deeply connected to Star-Lord. And again, this movie wouldn't work nearly as well if it wasn't for Volume 2, connecting Star-Lord to Ego and all of that kind of stuff. That's all great for the overall storytelling, but in regards to fleshing out the group dynamic, these purely evil characters that really aren't attached to the Guardians per se, at least on like a full core-to-core, familial, even blood level, it allows the Guardians to flourish in themselves, and then it allows the evil person to it allows the audience to hate the evil person based off of pure hatred. Because in all reality, there's two reasons why we don't like the High Evolutionary, at least at the baseline. First of all, he tortured Rocket. That's why the Guardians don't like him. And secondly, he just destroys planets of people that he does experiments on. It's two pretty basic things in the world of the Guardians of the Galaxy, and so I think it was just the perfect choice to just have someone that's, again, pure evil. But the final thing I want to talk about, and this is where I'll get into the most amount of spoilers in the entire video, is how this film has perfect character work. But I want to go through the individual characters because throughout the course of the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy, we've learned a lot about these characters. We love them, we hate them. There's always a dynamic in the group. And this movie's main purpose was to close that out. Like I said, this feels like more an epilogue than anything else. I think the first and honestly main character that I need to talk about here is Rocket. And like I said earlier in this video, I cried 3 separate times. I cried twice in the second act and then once at the very end of the movie, I think. And the 2 times I cried in the second act were when Rocket was in the cage with his friends. That scene absolutely tore me apart. I think they were all like deciding on their names. And Rocket said something along the lines of, and don't quote me on this, someday I'm gonna build a machine with my friends and we're gonna fly into the forever and beautiful sky.
Someday I'm gonna make great machines that fly. And me and my friends are gonna go flying together into the forever and beautiful sky. Lila and Teefs and Floor and me. Rocket.
I don't know if this was the exact scene that was in the clip, but they released a clip over a week ago with Rocket and his friends inside of a cage. So it might be the same thing. I never ended up watching the clip, so I don't know for sure. But I'm so glad I didn't watch it because with all of the context of the flashbacks and connections of these characters, I felt so much emotion watching it for the first time in the theater. And then the second time I cried in regards to Rocket was when Layla died and like he was talking to Layla outside of the cage and the High Evolutionary shot her down. That was also really sad. And then when he went up to the High Evolutionary and started scratching his face, I don't know if it was tears from like kind of like the pain that Rocket was also going through, or if I was just crying from before. It was a lot of tears in that one scene. It was just so much happening. And I think why Rocket as a character excels so much is because he's an animal. And a lot of times throughout this movie, they faked deaths. They did a lot of going back and forth on it. They even did it with Star-Lord at the end of the movie, which I'll talk about in just a second here after these other characters. But the way that they fake out Rocket's death is perfect because you have all of these surrounding elements that are not within like Rocket's head, because all the flashbacks and then even the scene where he's in heaven, he's talking to Layla and then the 2 other creatures. You see him at the gate of death. You see him at the gate of death and you see that he's about to die. He's almost there. And then you see these outside emotions. You see Gamora, Star-Lord, Groot. You see all of these external elements that just raise the emotion by a million. And that's the Chris Pratt. I mean, I don't think he's like a phenomenal actor by any means, but I guess just him as Star-Lord in that dynamic with Rocket. And again, this is why I go back to the whole, it's so heavily based off of the first 2 movies, because you feel so much between this dynamic of Star-Lord and Rocket because of what they've gone through, because of what they've done together. The first thing I thought of whenever Star-Lord said something along the lines of, I can't lose someone else again, one of the first things that just flashed into my head after rewatching the first 2 Guardians movies before Volume 3 was them fighting over who could control the ship in Volume 2, and that's why they end up crashing, and then Ego finds them, all that kind of stuff. The fact that a moment like that flashed in my head was just proof that this dynamic is so fleshed out, that it's so built through. I'm going to save talking about Star-Lord until the end. I want to go through the other characters and just their resolutions, their stories, all that kind of stuff. I slightly talked about Gamora earlier, but I really just love the way that she's introduced through the Ravagers, and then you also have that story, but also mostly how it impacts Quill himself. It's not really a Gamora-centric story, and I'm kind of glad that they shied away from that, and they didn't also try to kill her off or anything like that, because Zoe Saldana, she said multiple times, she kind of wants to go away from playing blockbuster characters, because obviously she's an Avatar, she's an Avenger, she's in all this big stuff. She wants to go do other things. That's completely fine. Just don't kill her off and do some BS so that she doesn't have to be in other movies. They do a great job. They utilize her for Star-Lord's story, and that's it. That's her purpose, and she's back with the Ravagers. Nebula, Mantis, and Drax, I kind of wanted to group them together just because in this movie, for a lot of the runtime, they are grouped together and in a really great way. These are three characters that have a completely different dynamic than one another. Nebula is cynical. Mantis is always basically just hyping up Drax's idiocracy. I think that's a word. But this dynamic of throughout the movie, Nebula just always being pissed off, but then Mantis eventually being pissed off at the fact that Nebula is always pissed off, and then Nebula being pissed off at Drax, and then Mantis protecting Drax. There is so much great dynamic between these three characters, and my biggest criticism with Volume 2 was the fact that a lot of the characters were split up. I still think Volume 2 is an amazing movie. It's an 8 out of 10 for me, but again, my biggest complaint is that the characters are always split up. In Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, the characters are consistently split up, even though a lot of the runtime they are together. In a lot of these essential character moments, they are split up. They're not all together as a group, but the dynamics, the pairings that they make work so well. You have Star-Lord and Rocket on the ship, obviously when they're reviving Rocket, all that kind of stuff. That's great. Emotional, all that kind of stuff. Amazing. But you also have Nebula, Mantis, and Drax on the High Evolutionary ship. A trio that you wouldn't really expect to work on paper, but when you look at the themes, the ideas, and honestly just the messages that are trying to be pushed across through Nebula's thick skull, depressing skull, whatever you want to call it, and you wouldn't expect to have an emotional moment between Nebula, Drax, and Mantis, but James Gunn pulls it off. Groot, I do have to quickly mention, I just like the way he's utilized. It's kind of a catalytic thing with like Adam Warlock. I really just like the way that he's put in here. But now to talk about Star-Lord, which seems to be the only Guardian that's actually going to be returning, because obviously in the post-credit scene at the very end it says, I think it was like the legendary Star-Lord will return. And this overall story sense does make sense because James Gunn is done with the MCU. He's done doing Marvel stuff for pretty much ever, in my opinion. Like, he's going to DC, but it seems like Star-Lord is the only character that they're going to be really utilizing moving forward. And I like that he's on Earth, like story-wise. Putting him back on Earth makes a lot of sense, and I really just enjoy the idea of Star-Lord being on Earth with all these other heroes. It's just really cool to me, especially with, like, we saw the other Guardians, like the new Guardians of the Galaxy with Rocket leading them. We saw them doing stuff on another planet, and that's cool. I'm happy that they're doing a second version of the Guardians. And obviously, again, James Gunn's not coming back to direct it. They might throw him in Secret Wars or Kang Dynasty or whatever the hell they're doing. But as for an independent story, I really like that they worked their way into keeping Star-Lord on Earth, but also feeling like they fulfilled his story. That was one of my biggest concerns going into this movie. Was I thought James Gunn was just gonna mass murder the Guardians of the Galaxy, or he was just going to take the easy way out for everyone so that they can just set it up with whatever Kevin Feige wants to do in the future. But they don't really do either of that, or should I say, they do a good mix of that. There's not a slaughtering of all these characters going on, but there's also not just a, we're going to put these characters on a platter for you to use next time. I think the fates of these characters is what surprised me the most. Mantis going on to do her own thing, Drax and Nebula staying on nowhere, Drax being able to be a dad. Like, that is one thematic storyline that I just was not expecting at all to pop up again. But James Gunn brought it back, and it does, like, at times you can be like, oh, it's just cheap, like, they're just doing, like, a callback thing to Guardians of the Galaxy. Like, I guess, but at the same time, it makes sense. He's the one who saved all of the kids. That's why the kids are on nowhere. He's the one who communicated with them. I think story-wise, again, the way they pull it all together is so unique, and it's just done perfectly. I'm done saying perfectly. I'm done praising the hell out of this movie, but just so you guys know, and if you couldn't already tell, I love Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. I think it is one of the greatest comic book movies ever made. But guys, that does wrap up my thoughts on Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Let me know what you guys thought of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 in the comments down below, and feel free to spoil away. Also, hit that subscribe button, notifications on, as I will be uploading way more Guardians of the Galaxy videos throughout this entire weekend. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time. Peace.